next up, we have Do the Right Thing. Not the Spike Lee movie, but might be referenced. Reciprocity and Right Relations in the Psychedelic Renaissance. So this is a pretty exciting presentation that takes us on this journey through the psychedelic landscape and envisions what is the psychedelic world we would like to live in. So we're going to go into legal perspectives on psychedelic therapy. We're going to go into plant medicine ceremonies backed by fair trade relationships with indigenous communities, and the post-capitalistic approach to healthcare in the new psychedelic paradigm. So all the things. Get excited for Ismail L and Lorna Liana.
I'm gonna move the bench.
Boom, 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 boom. Oh, you can do better than that. Come on.
Test. Thank you. All right, thank you.
Okay.
Test.
Hello. So, thank you so much for spending your time here today with us. My name is Lorna Liana, and I am the creator of EntheoNation, an online platform about psychedelics, shamanism, and visionary culture. And I am deeply honored to be here today to co-present with my colleague, Ismail L, who is here to represent MAPS. Now, Izzy's going to share a little bit more about his story in a bit, but I just want to extend my appreciation and gratitude for you showing up here today for a panel about doing the right thing. I know that sounds like something that your mom or Jesus might say, and the purpose of this session is not to guilt trip you, not to make life dull and boring, but to invite you to participate in this incredible phenomena that's happening right now called the psychedelic renaissance, and to participate in a way with intention and awareness so that we co-create an inclusive movement that is grounded in solidarity with the people of the global north and the people of the global south. So before we dive into some of the deep conversations and topics we're going to cover today, I just want to share with you a little bit about my background. So I started my platform, EntheoNation, a little over 2.5 years ago, and currently, this platform publishes all kinds of content around psychedelics with a focus on indigenous culture and sacred plant medicines. And currently we reach probably over 100,000 people all over the world through our podcast, the YouTube channel, email list, Facebook group, and our website. And I just want to share with you that this is not only an amazingly profound work that I'm grateful to be doing. It is the culmination of 14 years of following a sacred mission and a purpose that I received working with the indigenous tribes deep in the Brazilian Amazon. And this ability, this gift of sacred plant medicines to connect you with the deepest purpose of your life is something that is open and available to all of you. So I want to start with 3 questions, and I would like to ask you to answer them honestly. And I promise that you're not going to get into trouble because we are in Portugal. Yes. Woo! Viva Portugal! So, how many of you here in the audience have experienced psychedelic plants, fungi, or molecules manufactured in a lab? Raise one hand. Now, how many of you here have had a life-transforming experience? Have this be a life-transforming experience? Raise both hands. Wow, look at that. Yes. And how many of you here have then gone on from that profound life-transforming experience to start something powerful and positive, like write a book, create amazing music or art, launch a social program, or even found a company? Give a big shout, woohoo! Wow. That's half the room right there.
Great. Can everybody hear me okay? If I start speaking too quickly, just like do a sign, because I get really excited about this stuff. and I just start mumbling all my words, and even when I'm speaking to native English speakers, that can be a problem. And I know that we have a huge dynamic diversity of humans in this room, maybe some other entities and spirits, you never know. So I appreciate that. So first off, it looks like there's a lot of interest here. I noticed not everybody raised their hand, and before introducing myself and giving a little bit of my story and getting to the big questions we're talking about, I want to start by saying that this talk is not just for the people who've taken psychedelics. It's not just for the people who have had transformational experiences already. It's not just for the people who might even be interested. The reality is that the practices that we hope to share and kind of the way of being that we hope to share in this talk ought to be applicable to anything in your life, to anything that you have a relationship with. And we'll come back to the word relationship over and over. Before continuing out, I want to ask one more question to have people raise their hands. Who here was there for Pat McCabe's talk, Woman Stands Rising? Was anyone there? Okay, because I'm going to be referencing what she said a lot, because that was some serious brilliance and wisdom that was dropped in that talk. So hi, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. My name is Ismail L, and I'm so happy to be here right now. This is my second boom. I came in 2016 with the amazing folks at Cosmicare. Can we give a round of applause for Cosmicare for just like keeping everyone really aligned, really dialed in? Because that work is so important, that harm reduction work is so important, and that harm reduction often comes after something goes awry, something goes wrong. So what we're going to talk about today is how to, everything leading up to the experience, from the more tangible to the more esoteric. And I think that when you find more alignment with the way that you engage with these substances, you'll find that maybe those harms aren't so challenging or bad as you once thought. So I currently work as the Policy and Advocacy Counsel at the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. That's a lot of syllables. We also are known as MAPS. MAPS has been around for something like 32 years now. I'll give a little bit more background on the work that we do as part of the presentation. I also work as the chair of the board of directors for Students for Sensible Drug Policy, which started in the United States, but is now an international organization. And if anyone here is a student in university at any level, check us out, ssdp.org. It's a really great platform for students to join to fight the war on drugs. And I also have the pleasure of working with the Ayahuasca Defense Fund and with chacruna.net, two amazing entities that put a lot of information out about plant medicine, about the way to be with them, about how to educate yourself and understand exactly what's going on here. But independently of my titles, I'm also a multiracial person. I was born in California, but my father's heritage is in India and Pakistan and the Middle East. And my mother was born in Colombia, and her heritage is in South America and in Africa and in Europe. So a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about today that talk about this cross-cultural overlap are very personal to me because I have lived them and experienced them in my own body. I really don't have a choice but to deal with this stuff. So part of the reason we were excited to come here today and share this is because these are things that we think about all the time, that we talk about all the time. This isn't just some presentation that we're making up for the sake of you wonderful people. Not that I would have a problem with that. So in this talk today, we're going to look at kind of three large questions. As you can see here, the first one is really important, I think, for a lot of people here. How does someone from the global north utilize psychedelics and sacred plant medicines in an intentional and responsible way? Global north is another term that people sometimes call the West. Sometimes people use the kind of racist term developed world, as if the rest of the world isn't developed. But really what we're talking about is countries that have access to resources, that have either via innovation, via plundering, via colonialism. There's a category of places that a lot of us come from that have a lot of resources for a variety of historical reasons. So we're going to be talking about people from those places and this social context that we come from. I might add that people who are physically in the global north, physically in the United States, for example, don't always have access to those resources, so that's a piece of it. The second question is, how do we recognize the truth of the indigenous struggle and experience? And how do we respond in a way that inspires collaboration and creates solidarity? This is going to be along the difference of allyship versus accompaniment. What does it mean to be an ally with someone versus to accompany them, to be an accomplice with them in their struggle? And then the third question is, what is the difference between plant medicine and a chemical molecule? And how should they be treated differently when they are used, if at all? So we're going to be covering these themes. We're not going to answer these questions completely because these answers are co-created. They're created by our culture, by our society, by experience. And instead of trying to give you clear answers, if that's what you're looking for, you should probably just go. I'm just kidding, don't leave. You can just kind of ponder on these questions, and we'll kind of go into a little bit more depth as we go, and maybe give you some tools to work with in your own inquiry.
So I'd love to kick off this conversation exploring these various themes on, first of all, Izzy, how on earth did we get to this idea that psychedelics, especially psychoactive plants that have been used thousands of years by indigenous people, how do we get this idea that they're harmful and therefore should be very, very illegal?
Yeah, that is a good question. And again, I'm really grateful to be in Portugal, where we have a slightly more progressive drug policy scheme, which has decriminalized the use of substances. But you're right, how did we get here? What on earth are we doing in this place where these substances that are being scientifically, culturally, historically proven to have all of these amazing impacts on all of these amazing people, to be literally criminalized, banned, prohibited in this way that we currently know? So you heard Chiara speak earlier, I hope. You've probably heard a lot of people mention that a lot of these substances, certainly not the molecules, I'll get to that in a second, but absolutely the plants, the animals, have actually been utilized for thousands and thousands of years. We have lots of information about how multiple tribes, multiple indigenous people, multiple cultures over the course of history, over the course of the entire world, have engaged with these substances in a particular way. And for most of history, that way, that practice, was actually kind of one of the defaults. Goddess worship, non-dominance-based societies, partnership, the relationship with the divine. These things that in our world have started to kind of either been completely suppressed or that pop out in really strange and not always healthy ways. So we've got thousands of years of use, and as a result of that, you have all of these practices that we know have these impacts on people. I would argue that the modern war on drugs as we know it, the groundwork for it was laid in part by the colonial domination of the world. And I don't mean just by Europeans, but by the process of shifting from partnership-based to dominance-based societies. When people from somewhere, you all know where, ended up in the New World, they discovered these practices that kept deep social, political, interpersonal cohesion within these cultures. Now, when you're an invading force and you want all of someone's resources, the strength of that community is actually a threat to you. So I believe that the process of shifting out, pulling out the indigeneity, those cultural practices from many of these places around the world was the beginning of what we now know of as this highly restrictive, highly prohibitive, criminalized understanding of how we deal with substances in general, altered states in general, but especially the psychedelics and plant medicines.
So is that how we ended up with certain other drugs being very legal, like sugar and, alcohol, tobacco? What do you think?
That's a great question, and it's actually interesting the way this is separated, because those have stayed legal for a few reasons, one of them being that they're very, very profitable. It's really hard to profit off of other substances. It's hard to create a system, a global system of slavery, genocide, and domination to run the economy for a lot of other substances. But what's interesting, actually, is that even up until the late 1800s, entities like the Dutch and British government and companies out of there were still making a lot of money off of a lot of drugs, like opium, like coca. And so actually, when the United States, us over here, decided that the new way of dealing with it was not restricting the economy, but was actually prohibiting substances, a lot of the developed states were actually kind of opposed. They were like, wait a minute, we're making money off of this stuff. Why would we ban it? But enter this wonderful concept called racism. So in the late 1800s, the United States banned opium on the West Coast, partially as a result of the influx of Chinese immigrants who came to help work on the railroads. 50 years later, in the early 1900s, you have the criminalization of marijuana in the United States, also as a result of the post-Mexican-American War and us, as Americans, making sure that we could secure our borders. It's amazing how that language hasn't changed in nearly 100 years. And then soon after that, the US began its process of kind of shifting the global paradigm from making money and exploiting to criminalizing and exploiting. So then began the modern war on drugs, what we know as the shift in the 60s and 70s into this criminalized thing that influenced the UN, that then kind of fed into a whole bunch of other countries. And now, prohibition is the norm. For those of you that live in Portugal, power to you, but for many of us that live in the rest of the world, we are operating under a system where not only are these drugs criminalized, but they're banned, they're prohibited, they're stigmatized. And like colonialism, drug prohibition has been used throughout history as a method of social and economic control. And in this case, I think we shift from economic control to social control, and looking at the populations of people who are using different drugs. Just like when people arrived and saw the indigenous people of Mesoamerica utilizing peyote as a sacred sacrament to keep their culture unified in many ways. Taking that away meant taking away from the power of those people. So it's clear that society's relationship with altered states, healing, and the substances that facilitate them has changed over time. And today, we are beginning the process very slowly of shifting back into an understanding of how to healthily respond to and engage with altered states and the substances that cause them. So people say that because of this shift that we're beginning to understand, that we're in a psychedelic renaissance. That's a term that gets thrown around. There's a book by Ben Sessa called Psychedelic Renaissance. If you look on the internet, Psychedelic Renaissance, you'll see 1,000 articles from the last 2 years. But what exactly does the psychedelic renaissance mean for people who live in the global north? I'm going to start by just giving a little bit of an overview of where we're at in the world of psychedelic law, policy, medicine, and then we'll get into like the really deep stuff. This is just to give us all kind of a perspective of where we're at. So after all of these drugs and a lot of their research was criminalized and then took underground in the late 50s, early 60s, into the 70s, we had a multi-year drought of research. Literally decades with no science, sure, a lot of like informal research. I'm sure there are people in here who were definitely doing some informal research in the 70s and 80s. Maybe not so many, this is a pretty young crowd. But the interest never went away. It just kind of went underground. So now we're at a place where science maybe is getting close to overcoming politics. The belief that science and that the sciences and this research, scientific research, the clinical research in the lab, can prove to us that these substances that were banned so many years ago actually have value. So there's been a huge renaissance of research. First beginning in the early 90s, and then leading into the 2000s and up till today. This might be a good time to describe MAPS and what we do. MAPS was formed about 32 years ago, right after MDMA was criminalized in the United States. With the goal of doing the clinical research to understand the medical use of these substances because of the history and knowledge of the use of these substances that occurred before criminalization. The therapists that were using in psychotherapy before it was criminalized. The people who were using LSD and mushrooms in therapy and psychotherapy to cure people, to heal people, to treat people with a variety of problems. So suddenly there's all this research. We've got a lot of really good science coming out. MAPS recently in our phase 2 studies for MDMA for PTSD showed that 61% of the people that go through the MDMA treatment no longer qualified for having PTSD immediately after. And a full year later, that number actually increased to 68%. We're literally right now this summer starting phase 3 with the intention of legalizing MDMA as a medicine in the United States, with the intention of having that done by 2021. I'm also very excited to share that we have begun the process of negotiating with European Medicines Agency with the intention of doing the same in Europe, hopefully 2, maybe 3 years after that. So things are moving. MDMA might be the first substance to puncture the FDA, the EMA, the scientific method, to show with the standards of the West, of the North, exactly how well these substances work and exactly what they do and in what contexts. So we have a lot of space here. But in the North, what I've noticed is that we're also developing this responsibility, and that's why I have these points. We're being called to clearly see and deal with the shadows that come up in society with the help of these powerful tools. We too must responsibly steward knowledge and access to psychoactive plants and molecules for our own communities. For so long, we've had a history of all of this use, of all of these people, using these substances responsibly. And now we have an opportunity for ourselves also to be aware of, to be educated about, and to use these substances in a way that actually has benefit for all the people. So how exactly can psychedelics lead us to a greater sense of purpose and catalyze massive positive change? We all know, you saw it, I saw it, we all know how it can happen within ourselves. But how does that happen at a larger scale? Lorna.
Well, this is where I would say the indigenous wisdom can really help us. So if you were to strip away all the stigma around the legal aspects, and of course, the legacy of the drug war, and how it's very easy for us to default back to that narrative that we're doing something bad. If you look at some of the indigenous cultures that work with these, with psychoactive plant medicines like iboga, ayahuasca, San Pedro, peyote, the fungi, the magic mushrooms, you will notice that consistently in these cultures, there is a reference to these living organisms that come from the earth as being teachers and divine guides, that in fact they've been around longer on this planet than humans have, and they have a great deal of wisdom to share with humanity. So one of the most powerful ways to engage in the expanded states of consciousness that these plant medicines can bring is to cultivate a relationship with these plant allies, and to be willing to ask, be willing to be an apprentice, be willing to seek guidance and answers, and especially guidance towards the deeper purpose of your life. Because if you happen to consider yourself as a spiritual being having a human experience on this planet, chances are you came here to this earth to fulfill a sacred purpose. And so to continue to explore through these expanded states of consciousness, which are our human right. Cognitive liberty is a divine human right, and indigenous peoples all over the world have been accessing expanded states of consciousness, communicating with spirits, and traveling to the spirit world for thousands of years. And we can too, as citizens of, as people living in a modern planet.
So we've got the good stuff about what's happening in the North, science, research, awesome, healing, therapy. And we've got a little bit about this like high-level stuff, but what exactly does a psychedelic renaissance, which I want to draw attention now is a European word and is about a European process, we'll come back to that later, mean for the indigenous people who work with psychoactive plant medicines in the global south? So you've had a lot of experience working in Brazil, in the Amazon, you've met a lot, you've spoken to a lot of people. What's going on there?
One of the things that I feel that I've been deeply honored to witness over the many years that I've been going there. I've been going there since 2004. Granted, there are many individuals that have gone there even longer, but in the time that I've been visiting the South, primarily Brazil is where I have most of my my indigenous relationships. I would say that I've been seeing a flourishing of their culture. And so, you know, if you go down to Brazil and spend time in the Amazon and get to know some of the, you know, anthropologists and the indigenistas that are working there as well, you know, you will discover, you know, certain currents that have been happening. And one of the powerful benefits of this psychedelic renaissance that's happening in the North and the increase in interest and demand for sacred plant medicines is that there's much more cultural exchange. And so after 500 years of persecution, slavery, and genocide, for the first time after hundreds of years are the indigenous peoples in these areas experiencing genuine interest from outside people, outsiders, who are traveling long distances to spend time with them, to visit their villages, to participate in indigenous festivals, and there is a genuine interest in their culture, in their wisdom, and friendships that are being forged. And then another aspect of this renewed interest is also this this resurgence of pride in their own culture. And there's a desire, especially for the indigenous tribes who have lost their culture, or some people might say had their culture stolen from them through these really forceful and violent policies of assimilation. They are seeking out alliances with other tribes, tribes that have been able to preserve their ancestral wisdom, their plant medicine knowledge, and their cultural practices much better because they happen to live in places that were harder to access. So one of the tribes that has been actively assisting some of the other tribes is the Ashaninka tribe. Now the Ashaninka are people that live close to the Peruvian border. There are Ashaninka in Peru and in Brazil, and they live close to the uncontacted tribes and the last expanses of virgin forest. And so, they are working with the other tribes such as the Puyanawa and the Kuntanawa. For example, these are two tribes that have lost a lot of their culture. The Kuntanawa have lost their language. I think with the Puyanawa, there might be 5 people in their village that actually can speak the language still. And so they have been working with one of the shamans who is, his name is Benki Pianco. He is an award-winning environmental activist. He has been the recipient of UN Global Equator Prize. He is a recognized social innovator. And so he has been working with some of the other leaders in these tribes to be able to learn how to make the sacred hape, how to make the sacred medicine, the ayahuasca, how to conduct ceremonies, how to sing certain songs, and how to work with the spirits and the plants. And so with this increased interest as well, you are seeing more of the indigenous shamans traveling overseas. And so that is expanding and spreading the awareness of their culture to other countries. And so this beautiful intercultural cross-pollinization has been, in many ways, greatly empowering for the indigenous people. So, if you happen to have the opportunity to go and spend time with the indigenous because of having connected with ayahuasca, and let's say if you had the experience of having a ceremony or participating in ceremonies in North America or in Europe and feel called to go down and spend time with the indigenous people, that is a really beautiful and profound experience that I encourage you to do. And when you do so, be aware as well that when you visit these other cultures, that your values and the things that may be considered right and wrong for you may be very different in these other cultures as well. So go in with a sense of openness, a willingness to learn, especially willingness to understand some of the history of the region, to really understand their experience being a colonized people who are still very much on the lower rung of the socioeconomic scale in the countries in which they've lived for the entirety of their history in many cases. And so when you go visit, please also understand too that the idea that you might have of who a shaman is might actually be different than what you expect. So for example, there's a tendency to consider shamans to be somewhat like gurus, but in fact down in the Amazon, while they might also be spiritual leaders, they are very much the village doctors, the plant medicine doctors. And so when you do go visit, if you do have a chance to spend time, please do make your time that you're there a net positive for these communities. So there's a belief that, for example, the medicine should be free because it's a spiritual medicine and that it might even be offered to you for free. But know that these communities are really just surviving on the bare basics. And a lot of the forests around these villages have been completely depleted of game. So they actually do need cash to buy food and medicine, such as antibiotics, anti-parasite medicine. They need to buy rice, beans, and beef. So please consider making a financial contribution. If you go visit some of the tribes in Brazil, you're going to be expected to bring a boat of your own supplies, as well as supplies for your host family and the community that you're staying with. And of course, when you visit, you might find that a lot of your new Indigenous friends are giving you presents. And so reciprocity is really highly valued, and people there are very curious about who you are. And so a lot of the gift giving is because they want to actually receive something cool from you instead. So they're giving to receive. So bring useful presents. Don't bring things that are going to create trash heaps in the jungle that do not biodegrade. Bring things like hunting knives, solar-powered lights, for example. Any type of watertight containers, dry bags are highly valuable, and nylon hammocks, for example. So bring goods that have value that can be used to make their lives easier. They will love it. And then also another thing that happens is because many of the tribes need cash, they find that the fascination with featherwork has commercial value. I would like to invite you to consider the impact of buying featherwork and understand that many of these birds are being hunted into extinction, and that many of the feathers come from birds that are either endangered or under pressure and close to or in critical danger of being depleted from the environment. So if you do receive feathers as a gift, that's one thing, but please reconsider contributing to an economy that is not environmentally sustainable.
So I want to say that there's a few levels to what we're trying to talk about here. What Lorna just shared is some very specific examples of how you can act with reciprocity, shared exchange, with people that you might be interested in engaging with, that you might be fascinated by because of the practices that they have, that they carry, that have impacted your life. But I will also say that there is a kind of a larger understanding of reciprocity, of that exchange, of that balance, and how it works on the material level, the things that we have, on the more political level, going back to what I was saying about this history of genocide and colonialism that was really based in taking, extracting. And then maybe even on a cosmic or spiritual level where it's like not just about those things, but it's also about how are you relating to the practices, to the people, to maybe your own practices, to maybe your own people. Are you fascinated by the historical culture of other people, but maybe haven't dived so much into your own history? Just something to think about as we go. So how has this renaissance, this interest that you described that makes people want to go to the jungle or go to the desert or go to Africa or go to wherever they're going, impacted indigenous tribes who use sacred plant medicines? You've talked a little bit about, we know the high-level history, but what about the more, maybe the darker stuff?
So while the psychedelic renaissance has also been revitalizing an indigenous cultural revival, at the same time, with the increased cross-cultural exchange, sometimes these exchanges end not in a positive way, but in tragedy. So it was not so long ago that Maestra Olivia Arevalo, an 81-year-old Shipibo Onanya, a plant medicine healer, she was wrongfully murdered. She was shot by a pistol, and the principal suspect was a Canadian man. And this Canadian man was lynched by an angry group of villagers shortly after the shooting. Now, this Canadian man had crowdfunded his journey to Peru in order to learn about sacred plant medicines and ayahuasca and how they can be used to treat addiction. And he is actually believed to have been her student as well. And so while we may never know the true motives of why he did this terrible act and what transpired that fateful day, the police have since issued a statement indicating that the evidence does point to the fact that this person that was lynched was most likely the person that shot her. So here is an example on multiple different levels, a situation where there were very much a clash of values that went terribly wrong. And so the people of the global north, we have our particular problems, and those in the global south, they have their problems. And so those in the north that come and visit the south are often considerably more economically advantaged than the people that they're visiting. And so often, because they are powerful foreigners, they can get away with many things that a local person, especially an indigenous person, could never get away with. And the reason why these villagers took matters into their own lives is because as indigenous people, enduring hundreds of years of genocide, slavery, persecution, they rarely ever see justice being shown to them for anything, really. So this is not to justify the act of lynching. No, that is terrible and wrong. But understand that there is a very different way of doing things that you may not be aware of, that comes from a long history, that would be well for you to be knowledgeable about or try to educate yourself on if you do intend to spend extended time there.
I'll also say that after this happened, there were members of the Peruvian government who actually denounced the action and used that trope, dangerous savages, to describe the Shipibo people. So even within Peru, where ayahuasca is legal, where the practice has been turned into a somewhat economic venture, where there are certainly authentic, legitimate practices occurring, and even where the government has been historically fairly open and willing to allow it, we still have that same reliance on these old tropes, on this belief that these people are different and they're wrong, and because they have experienced nothing but injustice for hundreds and hundreds of years, of course anything they do to take matters into their own hands is clearly unfair. So maybe before going on, we can have a moment of silence, not just for Olivia, but also for the many lives that have been lost in this process of cross-cultural pollination, even when the intentions are good. Thank you. So, Lorna, we're talking a lot, we're using they a lot, because I have a little bit of indigenous ancestry in the way they were thinking about it. We all have indigenous ancestry if you trace it back far enough, but we don't identify necessarily as people of indigenous origin, and we're here telling you things that we've heard. Maybe eventually we have, even more and more people who are speaking for themselves. Because part of our role as people in the North, as people with platforms, is to elevate the voices of other people who are already speaking, who've already been speaking. So maybe you can give us a little bit about this example of this conference that occurred where some people who work with ayahuasca kind of said it themselves.
Well, so one of the aspects of, again, the power dynamics between the North and the South is that with the global expansion of plant medicines around the world, often what you're going to discover is that some of the voices that dominate that conversation are the voices of the people from the global North, the authors, the researchers, the scientists, people that have published papers, and people that have resources and who have founded organizations or have access to organizational resources, and so are thus much more mobilized to make impacts in the realm of policy and education, for example. Now, what tends to happen as a result of that is a lot of the indigenous voices are not being heard. And they're not being heard because sometimes the global conversation happens to be in English, and they don't speak English. They speak their native language, and they speak Portuguese or Spanish. And so one of the motivations for the first Indigenous ayahuasca conference called the Yupaka Haira, which is a word in the Hunikuin language that means people coming together to talk about important things, was a conference about ayahuasca among the indigenous people, for the indigenous people. And so many of the different ayahuasca drinking tribes of the Amazon, the Brazilian Amazon, came together to discuss some of the key concerns that they have around this global expansion. So, what they have observed is that, many of the northern researchers who are studying ayahuasca and other traditional medicines are not committed to the indigenous movement. While they may be advocating for legalization and protection, a lot of the conversation might be oriented towards the molecular level. And there isn't much attention paid to the spiritual or the cultural aspect, which is very important for the indigenous people, but the Western scientific paradigm does not seem to give it as much elevation. The other thing that is happening is that there are more non-indigenous than indigenous now consuming ayahuasca. And that many of the churches also, because they're very organized and have resources, they have much more legal protection around the transport and the consumption of ayahuasca. So while with the right paperwork, you can, the churches can import ayahuasca from the south, if a shaman is traveling with a large quantity of ayahuasca and is, apprehended at customs, that person gets put into jail. And among them, they also expressed concern that about how traditional plant medicine knowledge is being transmitted to non-indigenous people, as well as concern about how traditional knowledge is protected within their own communities.
So these are some real concerns. To give you an example of...
This is Antonio Macedo, who is a sertanista in Brazil, who has worked for 45 years on supporting the indigenous movement. And he, as a sertanista, his principal role was he worked for FUNAI, which is the Brazilian governmental department that handles indigenous affairs. And so sertanistas are the first line of communication between the government and the indigenous, especially the uncontacted tribes. And so he, in the 1980s, he's a contemporary of Chico Mendes. And he is also one of the people who has, in the 1980s, was successfully able to achieve federal recognition of the right to indigenous territory. So it was a huge win for the indigenous and a blow for the cattle ranchers, the oil prospectors, the gold miners, and the loggers of the area. So he's experienced many attempts on his life. And so he wants to, so if we hit play, you can hear Chai Macedo. Chai means brother from another mother. So Chai Macedo is how he's known in Acre. His perspective on what's happening when those of us in the global north consume ayahuasca.
Tem ditado popular que cabe na cabeça de qualquer pessoa e em qualquer língua, em qualquer visão, que é o seguinte: a água, se você do pote que você só tira a água, se você não coloca outra, o pote seca, né? A mesma coisa é a gente perceber isso na Amazônia. Se você, a quantidade de gente que toma ayahuasca hoje, ela é expressiva e ela cresce a cada dia. Ela cresce a cada dia. Mas toda vez que você só tira da floresta, só leva a ayahuasca para fora, você está escasseando o jardim da ayahuasca. Você está levando a ayahuasca ao extermínio aqui. Então, daqui a pouco uma frustração aparece muito grande, sabe? Primeiro lá, onde as pessoas estão distantes do jardim, que é o fato daqui o jardim não ter mais como o que oferecer, né? E daí então as pessoas conheceram a ayahuasca por um tempo e ficaram nessa história de não conhecer mais, não ter mais aonde poder visitar, conhecer ou se servir. E segundo, a gente vai ficar cada vez mais derrotado, sabe? E triste pelo fato de que, para nós, a cultura mais forte que existe no nosso universo de vida.
So there is a sustainability concern that the global expansion of sacred plant medicines is creating, not just for ayahuasca, but also for iboga, and for also some of the amphibian medicines as well, the cambo, the bufo alvarius. So if we find ourselves engaging in the regular use of sacred medicines, please do consider the impact that it has in other places far, far away.
So let's talk about the impact on places that aren't so far, far away. Because this conversation comes up a lot, and we've given you a little bit of like high-level stuff about what happens if you actually engage with these tribes, with these people. Maybe they're your own people. And a lot of the sensitivity around that we see here in kind of the conversation you hear around cultural appropriation. So the other day, when Pat was speaking, someone asked about that. Someone asked, well, what do you think about native practices, for example, like sweat lodges? That was the example that this person gave, being brought out into the new age. And she gave a really interesting response that I thought was very wise. Well, first off, depends on who you ask, because there are some elders that are very strict about it, there's some elders that are very open about it. As Lorna said earlier, a lot of what I've heard in my own travels, in my own experience, in my own research, is that these practices, especially because for many people, myself included, we believe that these practices did not just come out of nowhere. They were granted by the stars, by the spirit, by the collective conscious that brought these forward. So how can you really say that practices that are from that collective only belong to one people? At the same time, there is this historical reality, this historical burden that has been disproportionately placed in certain places. And when we're talking about appropriation, before going into like whether or not that's a thing and whether or not that's real, I want to help contextualize this for people because it's very challenging to understand the lines between cultural exchange, when you're just like sharing stuff, and appropriation. So I actually think appropriation is a challenging word. I kind of wish it was misappropriation. But that kind of describes this duality. There's misappropriation, which is using something incorrectly or not appropriately or not understanding the history, which has its own harms. The misuse of practices that have been carried for such a long time, that have had these deep, long-standing meanings for a very long time. And then there's appropriation, which is usually used to refer to the profiting off of practices that have historically belonged to other people. Now, even that, there's a gray area, no doubt. But one of the things that Pat brought up the other day that I think is really crucial here is understanding the context of that historical burden. It's not enough to say that the practice that you experience, whether it's putting a bindi on, whether it's wearing a headdress, whether it's entering a sweat lodge, it's one thing to say that doing that enhances your life in some way or another, because maybe it does. It's not for me or anyone else to say that that practice for you does not work. It's more about understanding exactly what people who carry those traditions have actually suffered in order to continue them. When we're talking about Native American dance practices, Native American traditional practices, we're talking about practices that were actively exterminated, genocided, and destroyed and oppressed. There is a history of violent subjugation of these practices that now those of us from the North, or for those with lighter skin, can engage with without a single issue. Now, does it mean that the indigenous people, or we want everyone who experiences the danza or like the sweat lodge or whatever else to also be criminalized and persecuted and destroyed? Of course not. We're not saying that everyone needs to suffer equally. We're saying that if you recognize what went into the carrying of those practices, then you might understand why there's so much sensitivity around what you're wearing. I have seen headdresses here. I haven't seen headdresses in American festivals in 2 years, because in the United States, we know that wearing war bonnets, headdresses, actively disrespects the fact that headdresses and the people who wore headdresses were actively assassinated by the US government for years and years and years. So it's not that you shouldn't wear stuff in your hair, it's not that you shouldn't put stuff on your face. It's that if you're going to be doing that, sometimes you really just shouldn't, just to be clear. But if you're going to be doing that, to be really clearly aware of what it is you're representing, because we see it. I like to say that they say ignorance is bliss. Ignorance is bliss. I think ignorance is bliss only for the ignorant. Ignorance is bliss only for the ignorant. It is not blissful for the people who are experiencing the impact of that ignorance, because they have carried it, the generations have carried it for years and years and years, and it is usually not a laughing matter. There are things we can laugh about.
Okay, so is this gentleman here engaged in cultural appropriation?
So here's
What
the
do you
thing.
think?
You can't always tell just by looking at the color of their skin. It's not that this person's white, he has paint on, he's wearing feathers, he's appropriating. Context matters. What's actually going on here in this photo?
So he's actually in an Indigenous festival. So in this case, if you are visiting the community and you're participating in a festival, you're gonna be asked to get face painted. And if you're hanging out in your Bermudas and your sandals and your Western clothes, somebody's gonna come along, probably the chief, and hand you a grass skirt and make sure you put it on, and then you're gonna be sent to the person who's doing the face paint. So I see this as celebrating Indigenous culture with the Indigenous.
So just pay attention to that. So here we're going to get into some of the kind of larger pieces of exactly like what that means. So you've got appropriation, you've got how to show up in the jungle or in the desert, we're at a festival. Celebration really is a form of ceremony. I know that a lot of you have felt that. I'm certainly feeling this celebration as a ceremony, as a process of bringing all that up. But before going into all of that fun stuff out there, do you have any more kind of maybe tips of what we can do when we're engaging with these practices?
Okay, so one of the big questions that comes up is, are Western facilitators who serve sacred medicines, are they engaged in cultural appropriation? So the Indigenous tend to have this belief or saying that the plants are for everybody. Okay, I have rarely ever encountered the belief among the people that I've spent time with that ayahuasca is only meant for the indigenous. The medicines, the plants are meant for everybody. But serving the sacred plants is not. So there is a phenomena in the global north of Westerners who are self-initiating. And they're self-initiating, and their justification is because the medicine itself told them it was time for them to start pouring ayahuasca or offering peyote or San Pedro or bufo or whatever it is that they're offering, okay? With some of the sacred medicines that have a long history of indigenous use, there are certain protocols that you need to learn, and there is an apprenticeship that you need to do. And so in some cultures, you don't even get to a place of working with the sacred master plants until you've mastered and done dieta with the other plants. And then some of these plant medicine dietas will take years and years to do before you're even qualified to serve.
That's years, not months.
Yeah. And so often, too, in some of the more traditional cultures, when it is time, when you are deemed to be ready by your teachers to be able to serve these medicines, there is an initiation, a community. There's an initiation process where the community is bearing witness to your initiation. So permission to be able to serve medicines may be like an altar that is passed to you, but it's rarely ever an offhand remark. Okay, so that being said, there is still a great need for Western facilitators because, again, the needs of people in the global North are different than the needs of those in the indigenous communities, and so we do need facilitators who are a bridge. And if you do feel called to offer medicines, certainly it is not my position to say, yes or no, or whether you're qualified or not. That calling is definitely a deep inner. It's something personal to you and the creator. But I would like to inspire you, if you do feel called to walk the path of offering sacred plant medicines, to spend time with the cultures who were the original wisdom, the original protectors and carriers of these wisdom lineages.
I want to flag that we've just got a few more minutes. We've got about 5 minutes. We're going to have to zoom through the last pieces.
Okay.
But we got one more video to show you first.
Okay. So I wanted to share with you Diara Tukanu.
Everything we know is from ayahuasca and is from this ability to talk to the spiritual world. And so I used to say that we are ayahuasca. And we don't own it. We are born from it as culture, as nation, as memories, as art, as medicine, as science. Everything we are is from ayahuasca, is from Kapi. And I believe it's the same for other indigenous nations that also have this plant with its several names, Uni, Uxi, Camarambe, Yahé. These nations have all their knowledge and their vision of the world through the vision of ayahuasca.
So we've got a few extra minutes, but I want to start bringing this in. So what you've heard so far are a lot of challenges, a lot of really hard truths, a lot of really complex ideas that are definitely not, as we said earlier, going to be answered in the next 7 minutes that we have. But I am hoping that we're starting to wonder how we can use these challenges as opportunities for personal, social, and cultural growth. How can we come up to these complexities and instead of responding to that guilt and the shame with closing, with rejecting, with responding with more of the rejection of those feelings, but maybe with an honoring of those feelings and a recognition that there are actually ways to engage responsibly. So I said earlier that we're being called to respond to the shadows that come up in society and with ourselves. I think it's important that we acknowledge that the toxins and darkness that we're discussing are being purged and must be healed, and that we must responsibly and intentionally steward access to these substances in our own communities. So just to get into that, I want to share this idea that in the North, where we are talking about psychedelics, we're talking about MDMA and LSD and psilocybin and all these molecules, and the system of medicalization, which for sure in the United States is not one that's completely balanced. It's one that's based on payment for service. It's one that's based on ensuring that the easiest way to make sure that you can stay healthy is that you have money. I understand that a lot of countries in Europe do it a bit differently, and I'm very interested in seeing how, after MDMA is legalized in Europe, how the systems here engage with these medicines in a way that makes them accessible for all people. But I think that one of the important pieces to remember is this responsible and intentionally stewarding access. So it's one thing for there to be points of access that are underground in prohibition, that are limited by our paradigms. And it's another to recognize that if we are going to acknowledge that these substances, whether they're plants, whether they're molecules, have these impacts on so many people, whether they're positive, neutral, or negative, there's a multiplicity there, that for people that can benefit them, we are ensuring points of access. And that means economic justice. That means access to healthcare as a right. That means access to these pieces of societal, political struggle that a lot of people prefer to keep separately from the conversation around psychedelics. And I think part of what we're trying to share here is that this political, social, psychedelic mishap, craziness, is actually all really related to one another. So I don't have time to go into it, but if you get a chance, 2:30 to 4 a.m. tomorrow morning, so in about 12 hours from now, I've been working on a wonderful documentary called Cura. Please come by to see a rough cut. And it's about, among other things, one of the ways that substances like ayahuasca have been used in more urban settings, and specifically to deal with, like you said, problems that people in the North have. And maybe seeing that some of those people that live in places like California even are actually not given access to the same resources, to the same spaciousness, to the same benefit that we think that everyone should have. So, to close, in this last piece, how can we benefit from sacred plant medicines without ignoring the truth of the indigenous struggle or feeling weighed down by guilt and shame? So I want to start by just talking about shame and guilt, and how it's easy to let that be the thing that metastasizes, to be like the primary feeling. And I want us to, instead of rejecting that, to think about the value, the benefit, the gift that we are being given by feeling guilt and shame. By the gift that we are being given of recognizing that there is an internal ethical compass that we do not know all the answers to, that humbles us to ask questions and to better understand. So, how do you do the right thing? You start by thinking about the gift that is offered by these challenges. Problems are not black and white or right and wrong. To learn about the significance and the power and the traditional intended use of these medicines. To create the time and find the money to spend the time with the indigenous people, learning their ways. And like I said, really digging into your own history. You'll find that when you start digging into your own ancestry, you find a lot more parallels than you might think. It's really easy to be caught up in the matrix. And finally, and maybe most importantly, be willing to listen, learn, and grow, just like Lorna was here in this amazing, super happy photo, and helping others do the same. A lot of you are the psychedelic person in your friend group. You're here, but you have a lot of friends back home where you're the one telling them the information. You're the one maybe helping out with whatever people need. You are a steward of your own community. You can carry the information. You can share this. It is a responsibility and obligation and offering for you to educate yourself or to be aware so you can bring that in your own ways to your own people.
And so understand, too, that relationships with Indigenous people are relationships that take time. And so be willing to give yourself years and be willing to spend time getting to know the individuals that you get to meet and hear the stories. And as stories unfold over meals or through, walks in the forest or fishing in the river, this is how these relationships that you can cultivate end up becoming something that really truly looks like an alliance over time. And so at the end of the day, if you are engaged in in a regular practice of using sacred medicines, using psychoactive sacred plant medicines, then consider all the ways that you can support the Indigenous movement. And also consider, when you work with these medicines and sit in ceremony, working with facilitators that have an ongoing relationship with the indigenous, that are giving back, that are traveling back to South America or to Africa to continue to learn from the elders. And then make your life a prayer and a ceremony that never ends while you consider all the ways you can keep giving back to the earth. And if you want a super easy 4 things that you can do right now, today, moving forward over the next few days, and I bring to you the words of Jose Mireles, who is the world's, probably one of the world's foremost experts in uncontacted tribes. And so for all of us in the global north far away, these are the things that you can do to help the people in the south.
Amarrar o pico e sair nu por aí, dançando e cantando. Não é isso. Mas é possível viver com menos. Né? É possível deixar a natureza em paz. Né? Eu acho que o que nós já fizemos no planeta está bom já. Nós já destruímos 50% do planeta. Vamos deixar os outros 50%. Esses povos fazem parte dessa floresta. Eles são parte integrante dessa floresta. Mas eu acho que as pessoas podiam fazer algumas coisas. Se quiserem realmente proteger esses povos, todo mundo pode fazer. Você pode fazer 4 coisas. Consuma menos petróleo, não compre madeira, não compre ouro e cheire menos cocaína. Você já está dando uma contribuição muito grande para esses índios. Não adianta a pessoa achar índio isolado lido e tá cheirando uma fileira de coca desse tamanho. Essa coca tá vindo da área dele.
Thank you so much. We're so grateful for your time.
Thank
Here's some
you.
resources you can check out. If you visit EntheoNation.com/boom, EntheoNation.com/boom, you can get this presentation. You can subscribe to the EntheoNation newsletter. You can subscribe to the MAPS newsletter. We love you. We're so happy you're here. Thank you.
All right, look up.
Yeah, come on, keep it going. Come on.
Thank you.
Lorna and Ismail, yes.